The ink was still wet on the divorce papers when Brandon laughed and threw a black credit card across the table. $10,000? He sneered.
This merger is
Severance
failing
pay
because
for a
of your
wasted
negligence,
7-year
Audrey.
marriage.
How
Take it
could
and
you
disappear.
authorize the transfer without
His
my
pregnant
approval?
mistress giggled from the corner.
Mommy,
That is more than she deserves, baby. Audrey
Really?
sat in silence.
Baby, I'll be
No
okay.
jewelry,
I love
no
you.
designer clothes, just a worn cardigan and trembling hands. They thought she was a broke waitress with nowhere to go.
Stop
They
struggling.
thought she would
You're under
crawl
arrest.
away and vanish.
No, please, I
But
didn't
they
do
did
it.
not see the man in the charcoal suit sitting silently in the back of the room. They did not know he was Harrison Caldwell, the billionaire who owned the very building they were sitting in. And they certainly did not know that by signing those papers, Brandon had just triggered a trap 7 years in the making. What Brandon did not realize was that Audrey was never just a waitress. She had written every business plan. She had coded every prototype. She had funded his first office with her own inheritance while he took all the credit. She had documented everything, every email, every recording, every lie, and now, with a billionaire watching from the shadows, she was about to take back everything he stole, including their 6-year-old daughter he was trying to rip from her arms. But Brandon would not go down without a fight. He would frame her for embezzlement. He would have her arrested in front of her screaming child. He would flee to the Cayman Islands with his mistress and laugh at her from a beach. He thought he had won. He was wrong. This is the story of how a woman they called boring destroyed an empire built on lies, and how $10,000 in severance became an $18 million revenge. Stay until the end. You will not believe how it ends. Lesson and value statement. This is not just entertainment. This is a survival guide disguised as drama. You will learn why documenting everything, emails, texts, bank records, contributions, can save your life when someone tries to erase you. You will learn why patience is the deadliest weapon against people who think they are untouchable. And you will learn that being underestimated is not a weakness. It is a superpower, if you know how to use it. Every woman who has ever felt invisible, overlooked, or trapped needs to hear this story, because the truth always comes out, and karma never forgets an address. Meaning of the story. This story is for every woman who has been told she is not smart enough, not strong enough, not good enough. It is for every woman who built something beautiful only to watch someone else take the credit. It is for every mother who has fought to protect her child against a system that did not believe her. Audrey's journey proves one simple truth. You do not need to be loud to be powerful. You do not need to be rich to win. You just need to be prepared and to never, ever give up on yourself. Your value does not depend on whether others see it. Your worth is not determined by people who benefit from your silence. You are not invisible. You are just waiting for the right moment to rise. The ink was still wet on the divorce papers when Brandon Cross laughed. It was not the polite chuckle of a man conducting business. It was the sharp, cutting sound of someone who believed he had already won. The conference room on the 45th floor of the Manhattan skyscraper smelled of expensive leather, stale coffee, and the impending destruction of a 7-year marriage. Brandon reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a black credit card. He tossed it across the polished mahogany table with the casual disdain of someone discarding trash. "Take it, Audrey," he said, leaning back in his ergonomic chair. $10,000. Consider it severance pay for a wasted marriage. From the corner of the room, a giggle echoed. Jessica Blake, Brandon's executive assistant, was perched on the windowsill, like a cat watching a mouse struggle. She was 26 years old, blonde, and wearing a dress entirely too tight for a legal proceeding. Her hand rested on her visibly pregnant belly. "That's generous, Brandon," Jessica cooed, not looking up from her phone. "More than she deserves." Audrey Cross sat on the opposite side of the table. She wore a simple beige cardigan that had seen better days. No jewelry adorned her fingers or neck. The wedding band she had worn for 7 years had been removed 3 days ago and placed in a drawer she would never open again. She was 32 years old, and according to her husband, she had failed at every aspect of being a proper wife. But what Brandon did not see, what Jessica did not notice, and what the sweating lawyer beside them could barely comprehend, was that Audrey was not trembling with fear. She was calculating. And in the back of the conference room, sitting in the shadows, like a statue carved from stone, was an old man in a charcoal three-piece suit. His silver hair was swept back impeccably. His hands rested on a cane he carried, not out of necessity, but as an accessory of authority. He had slipped in moments ago, and no one had thought to question his presence. No one except the lawyer, Mr. Gables, whose glasses kept fogging up from the sheer volume of nervous sweat pouring down his face. Brandon did not know that the man was Harrison Caldwell, the billionaire owner of the very building they were sitting in. He did not know that Harrison had been quietly investigating Nexus Stream for fraud. And he certainly did not know that by signing those divorce papers, he had just triggered a trap 7 years in the making. "Let me make this simple," Brandon continued, sliding the thick stack of documents toward Audrey. The paper made a dry, rasping sound against the wood. "I am tired. You are tired. We both know this marriage was a miscalculation." "A miscalculation," Audrey repeated softly. Her voice was steady, her eyes fixed on the word dissolution printed in bold at the top of the first page. "Do not play the victim." Brandon sighed, dramatically. "Look, when we met, you were waiting tables at some diner in Brooklyn. I thought I was rescuing you. I thought you would be grateful to be the wife of the CEO of Nexus Stream." He waved his hand vaguely, searching for the right words, and deliberately choosing the cruelest ones. "But let us be honest. You were never cut out for this world. You do not know how to dress for galas. You do not know how to talk to investors. You are just—" He paused. "Boring." Jessica snorted from the windowsill. "She is boring, Brandon. And she cooks weird food. Who makes pot roast for a VP of marketing? It is embarrassing." Audrey said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was her greatest weapon. Brandon tapped the documents impatiently. "Here's the deal. The prenup says you get nothing because you came in with nothing. But because I am a generous guy, I am giving you $10,000. That should be enough for a deposit on an apartment in Jersey, somewhere cheap. And I will let you keep the Honda." Mr. Gables, the lawyer, cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Cross, technically, the Honda is leased under the company." "Let her keep the damn Honda, Gables," Brandon snapped. "I am feeling charitable." He looked back at Audrey with a smirk that made her stomach turn. "See? I am a good guy. Now sign the papers. I have a lunch reservation at 1 o'clock. Audrey looked at the documents. Then she looked at the credit card lying on the table like an insult made physical. $10,000. 7 years ago, she had met Brandon when he was just starting his company. He was stressed, barely making payroll, and eating takeout at the diner where she worked to clear her head from her business school studies. She had listened to his endless pitches. She had reorganized his chaotic schedule. She had used $50,000 of her own savings, money from her grandmother's inheritance, to cover the rent on his first office space when his investors pulled out. She had written the code for the prototype. She had created the pitch decks that secured his funding. She had built his company from nothing while he stood in front of cameras and took all the credit. And now he was offering her $10,000 and a used Honda. You really think I am after your money, Brandon? Audrey asked quietly. Everyone wants money, Audrey. Especially people like you who do not have any. He scoffed. Just sign. Stop dragging this out, unless you are waiting for a miracle. Audrey took a breath. She reached into her bag. Brandon flinched, perhaps expecting a weapon or a lawsuit. Instead, she pulled out a cheap plastic ballpoint pen. I do not want your money, Brandon, she said. And I do not want the Honda. Suit yourself. He laughed. More for me. Just sign the line. Audrey uncapped the pen. She did not look angry. She did not look sad. She looked relieved. As the tip of the pen touched the paper, Brandon slid another document across the table. Oh, one more thing, he said casually, as if discussing the weather. Emergency custody modification. Audrey's hand froze mid-signature. Given my stable home environment with Jessica, Brandon continued, and your situation, Lily should live with us full-time. It is better for her. The blood drained from Audrey's face. Lily, her 6-year-old daughter, the only pure thing left in her life. You want to take my daughter? Audrey whispered. Jessica hopped off the windowsill, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Our daughter now, sweetie. I will be her new mommy. Do not worry. Boarding school starts at 7. You will barely notice she is gone. Brandon shoved a pen toward Audrey. Sign it. Do not make this ugly. You cannot afford a lawyer anyway. Audrey looked at the custody paper. Her hands began to shake. For the first time since entering this room, she felt real fear clawing at her chest. Please, she said, her voice breaking. Not Lily. Take everything else, not my daughter. Brandon rolled his eyes. God, you are pathetic. This is exactly why I am leaving you. Jessica tapped her watch. Tick-tock, kick Audrey. We have a nursery to decorate. The room fell silent except for the sound of Audrey's ragged breathing. She stared at the document that would take away the only person she had left. And then, from the back of the room, a cane tapped against the marble floor. Everyone turned. The old man in the charcoal suit rose from his chair in the shadows. He walked forward slowly, deliberately, each step echoing like a judge's gavel. I would not sign that custody document, Mrs. Cross, he said. His voice was deep, gravelly, and carried an accent that sounded like old money mixed with absolute authority. Brandon spun around. Who the hell are you? Security? Harrison Caldwell stopped at the edge of the table. He looked at Brandon with the kind of contempt usually reserved for insects. I am an observer, he said calmly, but I believe Mrs. Cross should consult an attorney before relinquishing parental rights. That document, I notice, does not mention the marital assets she is actually entitled to. Brandon's face reddened. She signed a prenup. She gets nothing. The prenup states each party leaves with what they brought in. Harrison allowed himself a slight smile. Are you certain you know what your wife brought into this marriage, Mr. Cross? Something flickered in Brandon's eyes. Uncertainty. Audrey looked at the old man. Who are you? Someone who pays attention. He placed a business card on the table. Do not sign the custody paper today. Take the weekend. Think. Without another word, Harrison Caldwell walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold and looked back at Brandon. Enjoy your lunch reservation, Mr. Cross. I suspect your appetite will diminish considerably in the coming weeks. The door closed behind him. Brandon snatched the business card from the table. He read it, and his face went white. Gables, he hissed to his lawyer. Why is Harrison Caldwell at my divorce proceeding? Mr. Gables looked like he was about to faint. I have no idea, sir, but we should be very, very careful. That evening, Audrey sat in the cramped office of Margaret Collins, known to her friends as Maggie. The space was cluttered with case files, empty coffee cups, and a poster that read, "In this house we believe women," hanging crookedly on the wall. Maggie was 45 years old, a divorce attorney with a reputation for taking no prisoners and charging sliding scale fees for women who needed help. She had been Audrey's best friend since college, and right now, she was staring at the contents of a worn leather satchel spread across her desk. "Okay," Maggie said slowly, picking up a stack of papers. "You need to explain this to me, because I am looking at what appears to be the original business plan for Nexus Stream, and it is in your handwriting." "Because I wrote it," Audrey said quietly. Maggie set down the papers and picked up a USB drive. "And this? The prototype code. I wrote that too, at 3 in the morning, while pregnant with Lily, because Brandon said the deadline was non-negotiable." Maggie's eyes widened. She rifled through more documents: bank statements, emails, screenshots, receipts. "Holy Audrey, you basically built Nexus Stream." "I built it. He presented it." Audrey folded her hands in her lap. "The prenup says we leave with what we brought in. I brought the company." Maggie leaned back in her chair, a slow grin spreading across her face. "This is why I tell every woman who walks through that door the same thing. Document everything: emails, texts, bank records, contributions. Keep a paper trail like your life depends on it, because someday it might." "I also recorded conversations," Audrey added. "Every time he admitted I did the work, state law allows one-party consent." Maggie let out a laugh that was half disbelief and half admiration. "You beautiful paranoid genius. He has no idea what is coming for him, does he?" "No." Audrey's voice was flat. "He thinks I am a boring waitress who cannot dress for galas." "Well," Maggie started organizing the documents into neat piles. "Let us see how boring he finds you when we take back what is yours." The next morning, Audrey received a phone call from an unknown number. When she answered, a crisp, professional voice spoke. "Mrs. Cross? This is Eleanor Vance, executive assistant to Harrison Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell would like to meet with you at your earliest convenience. He says it concerns a debt." Audrey's heart stuttered. "A debt? I do not owe Mr. Caldwell anything." "On the contrary, Mrs. Cross, he owes you 2 o'clock, Caldwell Tower. A car will be sent." The line went dead. At exactly 2 o'clock, Audrey found herself in an office that occupied the entire top floor of a building that bore Harrison Caldwell's name. The view of Manhattan was staggering, but she barely noticed. She was too focused on the old man sitting across from her. 3 years ago, Harrison began without preamble, there was a car accident on the FDR Drive. A young man was pulled from a burning vehicle by a witness who performed CPR until paramedics arrived. That witness disappeared before I could thank her. Audrey's breath caught. She remembered that night, the screaming metal, the smell of gasoline, the boy who could not have been more than 17, unconscious and bleeding. "That young man was my grandson," Harrison continued. "You saved his life, Mrs. Cross, and then you vanished." "I did not want attention," Audrey said quietly. "I was just there. You were more than just there. You were remarkable." Harrison leaned forward. "I have been keeping an eye on you since. I know what you built. I know what your husband stole. And I know he has been committing securities fraud to inflate his IPO numbers." Audrey felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "Why are you helping me?" "Because I owe you a debt, and because I despise men who destroy good women to feed their own egos." He slid a folder across his desk. Audrey opened it and found pages of financial records, internal memos, and highlighted irregularities. "This is evidence of Brandon's fraud," Harrison explained. "Enough to end his IPO and put him in prison. But if we use it now, the company collapses. You get nothing. If we wait until after you reclaim your stake—" "I get what I built," Audrey finished. "And then he goes down." Harrison smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had played this game many times before and always won. "Patience is a weapon, Mrs. Cross. Let us use it." Over the next 2 weeks, Audrey worked with Maggie and a team of forensic accountants provided by Harrison. They built a case that was airtight, irrefutable, and devastating. The custody hearing came first. Audrey walked into family court wearing a simple navy dress, her documentation organized in a leather briefcase. Brandon arrived with Jessica on his arm, smirking as if the outcome was already decided. Judge Patricia Hartwell was a woman in her late 50s with silver hair and eyes that had seen every trick in the book. She reviewed the evidence with methodical precision. Audrey's attorney, Maggie, presented the facts. Audrey was the primary caregiver. Brandon traveled 80% of the time. Jessica had zero legal standing as a step-parent-to-be. When Brandon's lawyer tried to argue that Audrey was unstable, Maggie produced 7 years of documentation proving she had handled every aspect of Lily's care while also running the behind-the-scenes operations of Nexus Stream. Judge Hartwell removed her reading glasses and fixed Brandon with a stare that could have frozen lava. "Mr. Cross," she said, "your emergency custody motion is denied. The child remains with her mother. Furthermore, I am concerned about some financial irregularities in these documents. I am flagging this file for further review." Brandon's smirk evaporated. Outside the courthouse, Lily ran into Audrey's arms. "Mommy," the little girl cried, "are we going to be okay?" Audrey held her daughter tight, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "Yes, baby, we are going to be just fine." For the first time in weeks, Audrey allowed herself to smile. She thought she had won. She was wrong. 3 days after the custody hearing, Audrey was putting Lily to bed in their small apartment in Brooklyn. The walls were thin. The radiator made strange noises. But it was theirs. It was safe. Lily was already in her pajamas, a book about brave princesses clutched to her chest. "Mommy, will you read to me?" she asked. "Of course, sweetheart." Audrey settled onto the edge of the narrow bed. "Which story tonight?" Before Lily could answer, there was a knock at the door. Audrey frowned. She was not expecting anyone. Maggie would have called first, and no one else knew this address. "Stay here, baby," she said, pulling the blanket up to Lily's chin. "I will be right back." She walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Her blood turned to ice. 2 police officers stood in the hallway. Behind them was a woman in a gray suit holding a clipboard. Audrey opened the door slowly. "Can I help you?" "Audrey Cross?" The lead officer was young, maybe 25, with the apologetic eyes of someone who hated this part of his job. "Yes." "Ma'am, you are under arrest for embezzlement and fraud. You have the right to remain silent." The world tilted. "What? That is impossible. There must be a mistake. Mr. Brandon Cross has filed charges alleging you stole $500,000 from Nexus Stream accounts and falsified company records." They were putting handcuffs on her, cold metal against her wrists. This could not be happening. "Mommy?" Audrey's heart shattered. Lily was standing in the hallway, her princess book still in her hands, her eyes wide with terror. "Baby, it is okay. Mommy just has to go answer some questions. I will be back soon, I promise." The woman with the clipboard stepped forward. Her voice was clinical, detached. I am with Child Protective Services. We need to take the child into temporary protective custody. No, Audrey lunged forward, but the officers held her back. Please, she is 6 years old. She needs me. Please do not take her. Lily started screaming. Mommy, Mommy, do not go! A CPS worker gently pried the little girl away from the doorframe. Lily's princess book fell to the floor, pages splaying open to a story about a queen who always saved the day. It will be okay, sweetheart, the CPS worker said in that practiced, soothing voice. We are going to take care of you. But Lily was inconsolable. Her screams echoed down the hallway as Audrey was led away, the sound of her daughter's terror following her into the elevator and out into the cold night. At the police station, Audrey was processed like a criminal. Fingerprints, mugshot, the humiliation of answering questions while wearing handcuffs. Bail was set at $500,000. She had no way to pay it. She spent the weekend in a holding cell, staring at cinder block walls and replaying Lily's screams in her mind on an endless loop. Meanwhile, in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, Brandon Cross watched the news coverage with a glass of scotch in his hand. Former CEO's wife arrested for embezzlement, the headline read. The anchor described Audrey as a disgruntled spouse who had allegedly stole company funds during the divorce proceedings. Brandon smiled and raised his glass to the screen. That is what happens when you try to outsmart me, sweetheart. Jessica emerged from the bedroom in a silk robe, her pregnant belly visible beneath the fabric. Can we get her apartment now? I want to redecorate Lily's room into a nursery. Already done. Brandon pulled her close. I had my lawyer file for emergency custody this morning. Since Audrey is in jail and clearly unfit, Lily comes to us. Perfect. Jessica kissed his cheek. You think of everything. By Monday morning, the damage was complete. Audrey sat in the courtroom for the emergency custody hearing, still wearing the clothes she had been arrested in. She had not slept in 3 days. She had not spoken to Lily since the night of the arrest. Brandon's lawyer argued that Audrey was a flight risk, a criminal, and an unfit mother. Without Audrey's side of the story, without her documentation, without Maggie there to fight for her, the judge had little choice. Temporary full custody is granted to Mr. Brandon Cross, pending the resolution of criminal charges against Mrs. Cross. Audrey felt the words hit her like physical blows. Lily. They had taken Lily. But the devastation did not stop there. The story went viral. Brandon's PR team made sure of it. Within 48 hours, Audrey's face was everywhere. Her mugshot appeared on gossip sites, news outlets, and social media feeds across the country. Gold digger gets caught, one headline screamed. Tech CEO's scheming wife faces decades in prison, declared another. Comment sections filled with vitriol. Strangers called her a thief, a liar, a terrible mother. People who had never met her pronounced judgment with absolute certainty. Her reputation, built carefully over 3 decades of hard work and quiet integrity, was destroyed in less than a week. On the 5th day of her incarceration, Audrey received a visitor. Maggie Collins walked into the visitation room looking like she had not slept in days. Her usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under her eyes. I'm so sorry, Maggie said, sitting across from Audrey at the cold metal table. I got here as fast as I could. The charges were filed under seal. They deliberately scheduled the custody hearing when they knew I would be in court on another case. They planned this. Audrey's voice was hollow. He planned all of it. Of course he did. Brandon is a narcissist, but he is not stupid. He knew you had evidence against him. He knew you were going to fight. So he struck first. Maggie reached across the table and gripped Audrey's hands. But listen to me. This is not over. They took Lily, Maggie. They took my daughter. Temporarily. We are going to get her back. We are going to prove these charges are fabricated, and we are going to destroy Brandon Cross so completely that his own mother will not claim him. Audrey looked at her friend. She wanted to believe her. She wanted to find hope in Maggie's fierce determination, but all she could see was Lily's terrified face, and all she could hear were her daughter's screams. "How?" Audrey whispered. "I cannot even make bail. I have nothing. You have evidence, you have me, and you have someone else." Maggie lowered her voice. "Harrison Caldwell posted your bail this morning, anonymously. You are getting out today." Audrey blinked. Why would he do that? Because he pays his debts. And because taking down Brandon Cross is personal for him now. Maggie stood up. "Get ready, Audrey. The counterattack begins tonight." Freedom tasted like cold December air and exhaust fumes. Audrey walked out of the detention center wearing the same clothes she had been arrested in 5 days earlier. Maggie was waiting for her in a black sedan, engine running. "Get in," Maggie said. "We have work to do." The next month was a blur of depositions, forensic analysis, and sleepless nights. Harrison Caldwell's team of investigators worked around the clock to dismantle Brandon's fabricated case. The evidence of Audrey's innocence was overwhelming. Digital forensics proved that the allegedly embezzled funds had never touched any account connected to Audrey. The transactions had been created using backdated entries in the company's financial system. Even more damaging, the timestamps on the falsified documents showed they were created 3 days after Audrey filed for divorce, which meant Brandon had manufactured evidence after the fact. But the most devastating discovery came from an unlikely source. Derek Cole, Brandon's business partner and best friend, had been quietly copying files for months. He had watched Brandon's behavior become increasingly erratic. He had witnessed the fraud. And when he realized that the SEC was already investigating Nexus Stream, he decided to save himself. Derek walked into the district attorney's office with a flash drive containing evidence of everything Brandon had done, not just the fabricated charges against Audrey, but the securities fraud, the embezzlement, the money laundering that had been funding Brandon's lifestyle for years. In exchange for immunity, Derek agreed to testify against his former partner. The criminal charges against Audrey were dismissed on a cold Tuesday morning in January. She stood outside the courthouse, breathing in the winter air, feeling like she had been holding her breath for a month. "It is over," Maggie said, standing beside her. "The charges are gone. Your record is clean. It is not over." Audrey's voice was steady, but her eyes were hard. "Not until I get Lily back. Not until Brandon pays for what he did." The custody reversal hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. This time, Audrey walked into the courtroom prepared for war. She wore a charcoal suit that Maggie had helped her pick out. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek bun. She looked nothing like the broken woman who had been dragged away in handcuffs. Brandon arrived looking significantly less confident. His lawyer kept whispering urgent things in his ear. Jessica was notably absent. Judge Patricia Hartwell reviewed the new evidence with the same methodical precision she had shown before. But this time, her expression grew darker with every page. "Mr. Cross," she said finally, "I have reviewed the forensic analysis proving that the embezzlement charges were fabricated. I have reviewed testimony indicating you deliberately manufactured evidence to destroy your wife's reputation and take her child." Brandon's lawyer started to speak, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "I am reversing the temporary custody order. The child will be returned to her mother immediately. Furthermore, I am recommending that the district attorney investigate whether criminal charges should be filed against you for perjury, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The gavel came down like a thunderclap. Lily was waiting in a room down the hall, supervised by a social worker. When Audrey walked in, the little girl launched herself across the room and into her mother's arms. "Mommy, I knew you would come back. I knew it!" Audrey sank to her knees, holding her daughter so tightly she was afraid she might break her. "I am so sorry, baby. I am so sorry you had to go through that. I will never leave you again. Never." Lily pulled back just enough to look at her mother's face. "The lady at Daddy's house was mean to me. She said I was in the way. She said I should learn to be quiet." Audrey felt a surge of rage so intense it nearly choked her. But she kept her voice gentle. "You never have to see her again, I promise." Outside the courthouse, Maggie was waiting with a car. "Civil case is next," Maggie said as they drove toward Audrey's new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom that Harrison had helped her secure. "We go after everything Brandon has: the company shares, the marital assets, damages for emotional distress, and defamation." Audrey looked at Lily, who had fallen asleep with her head on her mother's shoulder. "Whatever it takes," Audrey said quietly, "whatever it takes." The civil case proceeded through the winter. Audrey's evidence was irrefutable. The original business plans in her handwriting. The bank records showing her inheritance had funded the first office. The emails proving she had written the investor pitches. The recordings of Brandon admitting she had done the work. Brandon's lawyers tried every trick in the book: delays, motions to dismiss, attempts to seal the evidence. Nothing worked. In March, the judge issued a ruling that made legal history. The evidence clearly demonstrates that the plaintiff was a co-founder of Nexus Stream in all but name. Her contributions were systematically erased and credited to the defendant. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff and orders the defendant to pay $15 million in damages and settlements. Audrey sat in the courtroom, stunned. $15 million. Enough to start over. Enough to secure Lily's future. Enough to never depend on anyone again. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around her. "Mrs. Cross, how does it feel to win? Do you have a message for your ex-husband? What are your plans now?" Maggie stepped in front of the cameras. "My client will not be taking questions at this time. She is looking forward to rebuilding her life with her daughter." They escaped to the waiting car. Maggie was grinning like she had just won the lottery. "You did it," Maggie said. "You actually did it." Audrey allowed herself a small smile. "We did it." Harrison Caldwell sent a bottle of champagne to her apartment that evening. The card read simply, "Well played. The best is yet to come." For the first time in months, Audrey felt something close to peace. The nightmare was over. Justice had been served. She was wrong. Again. 3 days after the judgment, Audrey was making dinner in her apartment. Lily was at the table, doing homework, her tongue sticking out in concentration as she practiced her letters. Audrey's phone buzzed with a news alert. She glanced at the screen. Then she dropped the pan she was holding. Nexus Stream CEO Brandon Cross flees country. Company assets frozen. She grabbed the phone and read the article with growing horror. Brandon had disappeared in the middle of the night. His passport had been flagged at a private airport in New Jersey. A jet had taken off for the Cayman Islands. And in the hours before his departure, all liquid assets from Nexus Stream had been transferred to offshore accounts beyond the reach of American courts. Audrey called Maggie with shaking hands. "Tell me this is not true," Audrey said when Maggie answered. "Tell me he cannot do this." Maggie's voice was grim. "It means Brandon moved everything offshore before the judgment." The company is an empty shell. Your $15 million settlement? There is nothing left to collect. Audrey sank into a chair. So he just wins? After everything? He just gets away with it? I do not know. I am working with Harrison's team to see if there is any way to recover the assets. But right now, Maggie trailed off. She did not need to finish the sentence. An hour later, a video appeared on social media. Brandon Cross, shirtless and smug, standing on a pristine beach with crystal blue water behind him. Sorry, Audrey, he said, raising a tropical drink to the camera. You cannot squeeze blood from a stone. Enjoy your victory. I am enjoying my piña colada. Jessica Blake appeared beside him in a bikini, her pregnant belly gleaming with suntan oil. By the way, Jessica called with a mocking wave. Mommy Jessica is on vacation. They clinked glasses and laughed before the video cut off. Audrey stared at the screen. Everything she had fought for. Every sleepless night, every tear. Every moment of terror when she thought she would never see her daughter again. Gone. Brandon had escaped. Justice had failed. The system designed to protect people like her had been outmaneuvered by a man with enough money and enough contempt for the rules. Mommy? Audrey looked up. Lily was standing in the doorway, her homework clutched in her small hands. Are you okay? Lily asked. Audrey forced a smile onto her face. Yes, baby, I am fine. Let me see your letters. She helped Lily with her homework. She made dinner. She gave Lily a bath and read her a bedtime story. She performed all the motions of normal life while something inside her crumbled into dust. After Lily fell asleep, Audrey sat on the floor outside her daughter's bedroom and cried. She cried until there was nothing left, until she was empty and hollow and numb. And then her phone rang. It was Harrison Caldwell. Turn on the news, he said without preamble. Channel 4. Audrey walked to the television and pressed the power button with trembling fingers. The news anchor appeared, looking appropriately serious. Breaking news tonight. The Securities and Exchange Commission has issued an international arrest warrant for Brandon Cross, former CEO of Nexus Stream. Cross is wanted on charges of securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. According to sources, Cayman Islands authorities have frozen his accounts and are cooperating with American officials on extradition. Audrey's legs gave out. She sank onto the couch, phone still pressed to her ear. I do not understand, she whispered. How? Harrison's voice was calm, satisfied. Did you really think I would let him escape? I have been building this case for 2 years. The fraud evidence, the offshore accounts, the embezzlement, it all leads back to him, and his former business partner just provided testimony that filled in the remaining gaps. Derek Cole? He decided cooperation was preferable to prosecution. Amazing how quickly loyalty evaporates when prison becomes a possibility. Audrey was laughing now, or maybe crying. She could not tell anymore. But the settlement, she managed. The money. The SEC seizure includes all hidden assets, Harrison explained. Every account Brandon touched is now frozen. When the investigation concludes, restitution will be made to all victims, including you. He paused. You will get your money, Audrey. Every penny. And Brandon Cross is going to spend the next several decades contemplating his choices in a federal prison. Audrey closed her eyes. For a long moment, she could not speak. Why? She finally asked. Why did you do all this for me? Because you saved the life of someone I love, Harrison replied. And because some debts can only be repaid by seeing justice done. Thank you. The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. Thank me after the trial, Harrison said. The best part is yet to come. The beach in Grand Cayman was perfect. White sand, turquoise water, a breeze that carried the scent of salt and tropical flowers. Brandon Cross lay on a lounge chair beneath an umbrella, a half-empty bottle of rum beside him. He had been celebrating for 3 days straight, ever since his escape from American jurisdiction. Jessica was inside the villa, shopping online for baby furniture. They were planning to stay here for a few months, then move on to somewhere with even more relaxed banking laws. Dubai, maybe, or Singapore. The point was, they were free, rich and free, and untouchable. Brandon smiled and closed his eyes. This was exactly how his life was supposed to be. No nagging ex-wife, no ungrateful stepdaughter, no prosecutors or judges or anyone else trying to take what was rightfully his. He did not hear the footsteps approaching across the sand. Brandon Cross? He opened his eyes. A man in a suit was standing over him, flanked by 2 officers in the distinctive uniform of the Cayman Islands Police. "Who wants to know?" Brandon asked, reaching for his sunglasses. The man held up a badge. "I am Inspector Williams with the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service. You are under arrest, pursuant to an international warrant issued by the United States Securities and Exchange Commission." Brandon scrambled to his feet. "That is ridiculous. I am an American citizen. You cannot just—" "Sir, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." They were putting handcuffs on him. Here, on this perfect beach, in paradise. "This is a mistake," Brandon shouted. "I have lawyers. I have rights." "You have the right to an extradition hearing," Inspector Williams replied calmly, "which you will almost certainly lose, given the extensive evidence American authorities have provided. Enjoy your flight back to New York, Mr. Cross." Brandon's designer sunglasses fell from his face as they dragged him across the sand. A beach vendor picked them up, tried them on, and walked away whistling. Inside the villa, Jessica heard the commotion. She ran to the window just in time to see Brandon being shoved into a police car. Her phone rang. It was Derek Cole. "We need to leave," Derek said, his voice urgent. "Right now, before they freeze my accounts too." "What about Brandon?" "What about him? He is done. We take what is left and disappear. I have a plane waiting." Jessica looked at the police car pulling away. She thought about the 2 years she had spent pretending to adore Brandon, the ridiculous things she had laughed at, the boring dinners she had endured, the way he never noticed that her real affection was directed elsewhere. She touched her belly. The baby growing inside her was not Brandon's. It had never been Brandon's. Derek was the father, and Derek had money of his own, money that Brandon did not know about. "I am on my way," Jessica said. She threw clothes into a suitcase without folding them, grabbed her passport, left behind the jewelry Brandon had bought her because she did not need it anymore. At the airport, Derek was waiting beside a private jet. He kissed her as she approached. "We are going to be fine," he said. "Monaco, then Geneva. They will never find us." They boarded the plane. The engines started. Jessica allowed herself to relax for the first time in hours. Then the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. We appear to have some visitors." 3 SUVs had surrounded the plane. Officers in tactical gear were approaching from all sides. The cabin door opened. A woman with a badge stepped inside. "Derek Cole? Jessica Blake? You are both under arrest as co-conspirators in securities fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice." "What?" Jessica shrieked. "I did not do anything. I am just his assistant." "Ma'am, you signed fraudulent SEC filings. 17 of them. Your signature is on every single one." They handcuffed her. Her designer handbag fell open, spilling makeup, a burner phone, and $50,000 in cash across the floor of the plane. Derek was already shouting at the officers. This is her fault? She said no one would find out. My fault? Jessica screamed back. You said you had it handled. You said your lawyer fixed everything. They were dragged down the stairs, still screaming at each other, and shoved into separate vehicles. The last thing Jessica saw, before the door closed, was the sun setting over the Caribbean, beautiful, perfect, and completely out of reach. The trial of Brandon Cross was the legal spectacle of the decade. Federal courthouse in Manhattan, stone steps swarming with reporters, camera flashes exploding like lightning storms, protesters holding signs that read, "Justice for Audrey and lock him up." Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Investors who had lost money, former employees who had been cheated, journalists from every major outlet, and in the front row, sitting with quiet dignity, was Audrey Cross. She wore a simple gray dress, no jewelry, except for a small locket that contained a picture of Lily. Her hair was pulled back, and her expression was unreadable. Maggie Collins sat beside her, a legal pad covered in notes balanced on her knee. Brandon was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his ankles shackled, his wrists cuffed. He looked like a different person from the smug CEO who had thrown a credit card across a conference table and called his wife boring. His face was gaunt, his eyes were hollow. His hair, once perfectly styled, was greasy and unkempt. For a moment, his gaze met Audrey's. She did not look away. She did not flinch. She simply looked at him as if he were a stranger she had never met. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Forensic accountants testified about the fraud. They traced every dollar Brandon had stolen, every lie he had told to investors, every manipulation of the company's books. Former employees took the stand one after another. They described how Brandon had taken credit for their work, how he had threatened anyone who questioned him, how he had created a culture of fear and silence. Derek Cole testified for 3 days straight. He detailed every crime Brandon had committed, every scheme they had cooked up together, every moment when Brandon had laughed about how no one would ever catch them. And then the prosecution called its final witness. The people call Audrey Mitchell Cross. Audrey rose from her seat. The courtroom fell silent as she walked to the stand. She was sworn in. She took her seat, and for the next 4 hours, she dismantled the myth of Brandon Cross brick by brick. She presented the original business plans, written in her handwriting 7 years ago. She showed the bank records, proving her inheritance had funded the company's first office. She played recordings of Brandon admitting that she had done the real work while he handled the important stuff, like schmoozing investors. "Mrs. Cross?" the prosecutor asked. "In your own words, what did you contribute to Nexus Stream?" Audrey's voice was steady. "I wrote the original business plan. I coded the prototype. I created the investor pitch decks. I managed the finances for the first 3 years. I worked 18-hour days while pregnant, while nursing, while raising our daughter alone because Brandon was too busy building his image to be a father. And how did your husband acknowledge these contributions? He did not. He told people I was his housekeeper. He introduced me as the help at company events. He gave interviews, calling himself a self-made man, while I ghost-wrote his speeches." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. "Why did you stay?" Audrey was quiet for a moment. "Because I loved him, because I believed in what we were building together, and because I wanted my daughter to have a father who was present." She paused. "I was wrong about all three." The defense had no effective response. Brandon's lawyers tried to paint Audrey as a bitter ex-wife, but the evidence was too overwhelming. They tried to argue that Derek Cole was the real mastermind, but the paper trail led directly to Brandon's desk. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. On the charge of securities fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of making false statements to federal investigators, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of perjury, we find the defendant guilty. Brandon sat motionless as the verdicts were read. Whatever defiance he had left seemed to drain out of him with each word. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month. Outside the courthouse, Audrey was surrounded by reporters again. "Mrs. Cross, how do you feel? Do you think justice was served? What is next for you?" She stopped at the top of the steps and looked out at the crowd. For a moment, she considered walking away without comment. But there was something she needed to say. "I spent 7 years being invisible," Audrey said into the microphones. "I spent 7 years being told I was not smart enough, not pretty enough, not good enough. I spent 7 years watching someone take credit for my work while telling me I was boring." She paused. To every woman out there who feels invisible, who feels trapped, who feels like no one sees her contributions, I want you to know, you are not invisible. Your work matters. And the truth always comes out eventually. She turned and walked down the steps, Maggie beside her, leaving the reporters to scramble for their next question. 1 month later, Brandon Cross stood before the court for sentencing. He was thinner now. The orange jumpsuit hung loosely on his frame. His eyes darted around the courtroom like a trapped animal looking for escape routes that did not exist. The judge, the Honorable Marcus Webb, reviewed the case file with grim satisfaction. "Mr. Cross," Judge Webb began, "you have been convicted of multiple federal crimes. You defrauded investors out of millions of dollars. You stole credit for work done by others. You fabricated evidence to destroy your innocent wife's reputation. You attempted to take her child. And when justice caught up with you, you fled the country like a coward." Brandon's lawyer started to speak, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "I have read the victim impact statements. I have reviewed the evidence, and I have considered the totality of your actions over the past 7 years." He leaned forward. "Mr. Cross, you are not a businessman who made mistakes. You are a predator who systematically exploited everyone around you. You used your wife's intelligence and labor to build a company, then discarded her like garbage. You used investors' money to fund your lifestyle of excess. You used the legal system as a weapon against the mother of your child." Brandon was shaking now. "For these crimes, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison. You will serve your sentence at a medium security facility. You will not be eligible for parole for a minimum of 15 years. 25 years. Brandon's legs buckled. The guards had to hold him up. "Take him away," the judge said. As Brandon was dragged toward the door, he looked back at Audrey. His face was contorted with rage. "This is not over," he screamed. "You ruined me. You took everything. I will destroy you." Audrey met his gaze calmly. "Goodbye, Brandon," she said quietly. It was the last time she would ever see him. Jessica Blake was sentenced the same day, 8 years for her role in the fraud. To be served at a federal facility in West Virginia. She sobbed throughout the hearing, insisting she was just following orders, insisting she did not understand what she was signing. The judge was unmoved. As she was led away in handcuffs, Jessica turned and looked at the gallery where the spectators sat. "It was Derek's idea," she screamed. "The baby is his. He said we would be together. He said—" The guards pulled her through the door before she could finish. Derek Cole, who had cooperated with prosecutors, received a reduced sentence of 3 years. He would serve his time at a minimum security facility and be released on good behavior. The baby Jessica was carrying would be born in prison and placed with foster care. The news coverage was relentless. Brandon's mugshot became an internet meme. Jessica's courtroom breakdown was replayed endlessly on social media. The story of how waitress from Brooklyn had taken down a tech CEO dominated the news cycle for weeks. But Audrey stayed out of the spotlight. She gave no interviews. She posted nothing on social media. She simply focused on rebuilding her life with Lily. The restitution from the SEC seizure came through 6 months later. $18 million, deposited into an account in Audrey's name. It was more money than she had ever imagined having, enough to secure Lily's future, enough to start over completely. But Audrey did not spend it on mansions or luxury cars. Instead, she did something that surprised everyone except those who truly knew her. She started a company, she called it Lily Tech, and its mission was simple: help women entrepreneurs launch their own businesses, provide funding, mentorship, and resources to women who had been overlooked by traditional investors. Within a year, Lily Tech had helped over 1,000 women start companies of their own. Within 2 years, that number had grown to 5,000. Audrey also wrote a book. She called it Document Everything: A Survivor's Guide to Protecting Yourself. It became a bestseller. She was invited to speak at conferences, at universities, at corporate retreats. She told her story plainly, without embellishment, and ended every speech with the same message. Start documenting, start planning, start believing you deserve better, because you do. 2 years after Brandon's sentencing, Audrey stood in the kitchen of her brownstone in Brooklyn, making pancakes. The house was everything she had never allowed herself to dream about. Warm sunlight streaming through tall windows. A garden in the back, where Lily grew tomatoes and sunflowers, walls covered with artwork Lily had made at school. It was a home, a real home. Lily, now 8 years old, came bounding down the stairs in her school uniform. "Mom, my science project got accepted for the city fair." Audrey turned from the stove, spatula in hand, and beamed at her daughter. "That is amazing, sweetheart. I am so proud of you. Can Harrison come to the presentation? He helped me with the research." Audrey smiled. Harrison Caldwell had become something like a grandfather to Lily over the past 2 years. He attended her school plays, helped with her homework, and spoiled her with books and science kits, despite Audrey's protests. "I am sure he would love to," Audrey said. The doorbell rang. Audrey wiped her hands on a towel and went to answer it. Harrison stood on the stoop, dressed in his usual impeccable suit, carrying a wrapped gift. "Happy anniversary," he said. "Anniversary? 5 years ago today, you saved my grandson's life. I thought I would mark the occasion." Audrey stepped aside to let him in. He handed her the gift, and she unwrapped it to find a first edition of Jane Eyre, her favorite novel. "Harrison, this is too much. Nothing is too much for the woman who taught me that courage does not require wealth. It just requires will." Lily came running into the room and threw her arms around Harrison's legs. "Harrison, guess what? My science project got accepted. Is that so?" Harrison knelt down to her level. "What is it about?" "Renewable energy sources and their application in urban environments." Harrison looked at Audrey with raised eyebrows. "She is definitely your daughter." They had breakfast together, the three of them, laughing and talking as if they were a family, because in many ways they were. After Harrison left and Lily went to school, Audrey sat on her porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the quiet Brooklyn street. She thought about how far she had come. From a cramped apartment where she worked 18-hour days building someone else's dream. From a marriage where she was told she was boring, worthless, invisible. From a jail cell where she figured she would never see her daughter again. To this, to peace, to purpose, to happiness. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Audrey, it said. It is Brandon. I know you probably will not read this. I am writing from prison. I have 23 more years to go. Every day I think about what I threw away. Not the money, not the company. You, Lily, the life we could have had. I am sorry. I know it means nothing now, but I am sorry. Audrey read the message twice. She considered what to say in response. She thought about the years of pain, the humiliation, the terror of having her daughter taken from her. Then she typed a reply. New phone. Who dis? She smiled, deleted the message, blocked the number, and went back to watching the morning light filter through the trees. That evening, Audrey was the keynote speaker at a conference for women entrepreneurs. She stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces, young women, old women, women who had been told they were not smart enough, not tough enough, not good enough. Women like her. I spent 7 years believing I was nothing without him, Audrey said, that my contributions did not matter, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps he threw me. She paused. I was wrong, and if you are sitting here today feeling like you are invisible, like your work does not matter, like you are trapped, I want you to know something. She leaned into the microphone. You are not invisible. Your work matters, and you are not trapped. You just have not found your exit yet. She let the words settle. Start documenting, start planning, start believing you deserve better. Because you do. I promise you, you do. The applause that followed was thunderous. Women were crying, women were cheering, women were hugging each other. Audrey walked off stage feeling lighter than she had in years. 6 months later, a woman walked into the visiting room of a federal prison in Pennsylvania. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and sharp features. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, and she carried herself with quiet confidence. The guard led her to a booth separated from the inmates by thick glass. She sat down and waited. Brandon Cross shuffled in a moment later. He was gaunt and gray, a shadow of the man who had once swaggered through Manhattan boardrooms. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He sat down across from her and frowned. "Who are you?" he asked through the phone receiver. The woman picked up her receiver and smiled. It was not a warm smile, boss. "My name is Sophie Mitchell." Brandon's frown deepened. "I do not know any Sophie Mitchell. I am Audrey's little sister, the one she put through medical school while she was married to you. The one you never knew existed because you never asked a single question about her family." Brandon's face went pale. "Why are you here?" "To tell you something." Sophie leaned closer to the glass. "My sister did not just survive you. She thrived. She is engaged now, to a man who treats her like she deserves to be treated. Lily is flourishing. The company you stole, Audrey rebuilt it, better than you ever could. Her name is on buildings now. Her book is required reading at business schools. And your name?" She paused. "Your name is a punchline. When professors want to explain what not to do in business, they tell the story of Brandon Cross. When lawyers want to warn their clients about the consequences of fraud, they use you as an example." Brandon's hands were shaking. "I just wanted you to know," Sophie continued, "that everything you tried to destroy is more beautiful than ever, and you get to sit here for the next 2 decades knowing you could have been part of it. You could have had a loving wife who believed in you. You could have had a daughter who adored you. You could have had a life worth living." She stood up. "But you threw it all away for a woman who was sleeping with your business partner and a fortune that was never real in the first place." Brandon's mouth opened, but no words came out. "Oh, and Brandon," Sophie smiled that cold smile again. "Audrey says hi." She hung up the receiver and walked away without looking back. Brandon sat alone in the visiting booth, staring at the empty chair across from him. The phone was still in his hand, The dial tone hummed in his ear. 23 more years. That was how long he had left. 23 years of cinder block walls and fluorescent lights and the knowledge that everything he had lost was thriving without him. He put down the phone, he put his head in his hands, and he wept. Back in Brooklyn, Audrey was in her garden, planting tulip bulbs for spring. Lily was beside her, carefully patting soil around each bulb. "Mom," Lily said, "do you ever think about Dad?" Audrey paused, trowel in hand. It was a question she had been expecting for years but had never quite prepared for. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "when I remember the good times. Before everything went wrong." "Do you hate him?" Audrey thought about it carefully. She thought about the humiliation, the fear, the nights she had spent crying on the floor outside her daughter's empty bedroom. "No," she said finally, "I do not hate him. Hating him, that would take energy that I would rather spend on things that matter, like you, like our life, like being happy." Lily nodded slowly, processing this. "I do not really remember him much anymore. Is that okay?" "That is okay, sweetheart. You do not have to remember anything you do not want to." "Good." Lily patted another bulb into place. "Because I like our life the way it is now." Audrey smiled and wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "I like it too, baby. I like it too." They finished planting in comfortable silence. Mother and daughter, surrounded by the quiet peace of a life rebuilt from ashes. That night, after Lily was asleep, Audrey sat on her porch with a glass of wine, looking up at the stars. She thought about everything she had been through, the betrayal, the arrest, the terror of losing her daughter, the triumph of reclaiming her life. She thought about the woman she used to be, the one who wore beige cardigans and apologized for existing. That woman was gone. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and unafraid. Audrey raised her glass to the night sky. "Here's to new beginnings," she said softly, "and to never being invisible again." She drank, she smiled, and she went inside to sleep peacefully, in the home she had built for herself, the end, or rather, the beginning of everything that came next. 3 years later, Lily Tech had helped over 10,000 women launch their own businesses. Audrey's book remained a bestseller. And every month, in prisons across America, women who had been convicted of crimes related to domestic abuse or financial fraud received care packages containing a copy of Document Everything and a handwritten note that read, "Your story is not over. Start planning. Start believing. You deserve better." The note was never signed. But the women who received it knew exactly who it was from, because some lessons are too important to keep to yourself, and some victories are meant to be shared. If you believe that good people deserve justice, if you want to see a cheating husband and his mistress get exactly what they deserve, if you are ready for 90 minutes of drama, betrayal, and the most satisfying karma you have ever witnessed, then hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. Drop a comment telling me, have you ever been underestimated by someone who regretted it later? I read every single comment, and your stories inspire the content we create. Share this video with a friend who needs to hear that their silence is not weakness. It is strategy. And smash that like button if you are ready for Brandon Cross to learn the hardest lesson of his life. Now, let us begin. Closing statement. And that is the story of how a $10,000 severance check cost a man his empire. But maybe, just maybe, the woman he threw away found something worth more than money. She found herself. What do you think? Did Audrey go too far with her revenge? Or did Brandon get exactly what he deserved? Should Jessica have received a longer sentence? And what would you have done in Audrey's position? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one, and your opinions shape the stories we tell. If this story moved you, inspired you, or just gave you 90 minutes of pure satisfaction, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us create more stories about strong women who refuse to be silenced. Until next time, remember, document everything, trust yourself, and never let anyone convince you that you are boring. You are extraordinary. You just have not shown them yet. Content disclaimer. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful entertainment with valuable life lessons. We believe stories have the power to inspire, educate, and empower. Every character, every twist, and every moment of karma was crafted with intention to remind you that justice exists, that perseverance matters, and that your story is worth fighting for. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for being part of our community. See you in the next story.